Inde-Car on the 22nd of December. Now, I don't normally make urgent programs like this, but I think the urgency of the current international situation warrants a little bit of a heads up for everybody in Scotland. I'm not the first of anybody really, journalists or bloggers, to actually point this out in the UK. There have been at least 2 or 3 different commentators, both in England and in Scotland in the independence movement, who've pointed out the problems posed by Donald Trump's recent actions and his recent threats towards Greenland, Canada and Mexico. But what is this all about? How does it relate to Scotland if Donald Trump does something crazy? Well, the interesting thing about this is not so much the fact that what Donald Trump is doing is going to affect us directly, although it will, and I'll come back to that. The problem here is the situation that the UK has placed itself in. As you know, back in 2016, England voted to leave the EU. Scotland voted to remain in it. We were dragged out of the European Union. And that has left the United Kingdom with only one serious large-scale trading partner, and that was the United States. Now, it's also the only source of, I would say, global security. In other words, the UK is uniquely tied to the United States in terms of its globalized defensive systems, and that would be the nuclear weapons which are currently stored here in Scotland, about 35 miles from where I'm sitting at the moment. Most people don't realize that Britain's so-called independent nuclear deterrent isn't actually independent at all. The fleet of submarines that the United Kingdom operates, from which they launch their nuclear, or could launch their nuclear weapons, are largely owned by the United Kingdom, of course, because they built the submarines. However, the missiles which carry the warheads are actually the property of the United States government. And the launch permissions, the codes, and the navigational system information which is carried on those missiles is operated and controlled by the United States. So the only parts of Britain's so-called independent nuclear deterrent are actually the explosive warheads. In other words, the nuclear warheads are actually British, and the submarines are British, but everything else to do with how we deliver those nuclear weapons is actually dictated by the US. So we're not actually able, as the United Kingdom, or as a part of it, to launch those missiles independently to defend ourselves. We depend on the United States to do this. And unfortunately, the United States has, as its commander-in-chief, one Donald J. Trump. And Donald Trump, despite saying when he came to office for the second time that he was going to be a peace president, that he was going to end wars, and despite his ridiculous recent claims to have ended 6 wars since he came to office, this is a demonstrably nonsensical falsehood. In other words, it's a lie. He hasn't stopped 6 wars at all. He has, and I think that history proves this out, helped Israel to stop the Gaza conflict. But basically he's done that by helping Israel. He's not done that by helping the Gazans themselves. In fact, most of his policy seems to be aimed at emptying Gaza of Palestinians so it can be redeveloped into a luxury holiday resort, which of course is exactly what Donald Trump's main source of income is. He builds hotels and operates them. So his rescuing or his peacemaking in Gaza is largely aimed at enriching himself and creating opportunities for his hotel business. However, how does that affect us here? Well, I've gone through the issues of the nuclear weapons and how we don't control them. And that means that Donald Trump is a man who actually decides when and where these missiles should be fired, and at whom they should be fired, and in what circumstances. We don't have any control over that. We have also lost the protection of being part of the European Union. Now, although the European Union at the moment does not have its own bespoke military, it has national armies for all 28 of its members. At the moment, that is. However, the recent threats being made, not implicitly, but during the hybrid warfare which Vladimir Putin is carrying out in Europe at the moment, there is a threat to European security coming from the east, Now, we know about the war that's being conducted by Putin in Ukraine at the moment, and how the Ukrainians are desperately keeping the Russian bear at bay. But if Ukraine were to fall, that creates a huge security problem for the European Union, and to a large extent creates a problem for the United Kingdom, because we now know that the United States is not a reliable NATO ally anymore. Donald Trump has said several times that he wants to dismantle the NATO pact and wants America to withdraw from it, and there is a clause in the NATO contract, or the NATO rules, if you like, called clause, I think it's clause 13, which allows any member state of NATO to withdraw, although the mechanism for doing that is a little bit opaque. Nobody's really quite sure exactly how it would be done. However, an exit route does exist, and it's likely that, given Donald Trump's recent outbursts, that he has, in a fit of pique, done so many stupid things all in 1 week. It's hard to catalogue them all, but essentially the problem is this. Trump feels that he should be given a Nobel Peace Prize, but he thought, for some bizarre reason, that Denmark was the country which gave out Nobel Prizes, which of course it isn't. However, he's decided to take issue with Denmark by essentially invading Greenland. That's what he's proposing, invading the sovereign territory of Denmark, which manages, I think it's safe to say, the massive island of Greenland. Greenland is almost a continent by itself, but it has a very low population. But it's largely populated by emigres from Denmark. And so Trump seems to have seen Greenland as a way of punishing the Danes for not giving him a I still can't believe I'm saying this, for not giving him a Nobel Prize. Now, the people of Denmark have absolutely no power over Nobel Prizes. They are given by the Nobel Committee, which, if I remember correctly, is in Sweden. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe it's Sweden, not Denmark. So he's punishing the wrong people for something which they can't control. However, this shifts the Western balance of power dramatically, and is going to isolate the United States. Now, Sir Keir Starmer is in a very awkward position now, because with trade sanctions of 10% being put in place by Trump on all of the EU member states and the United Kingdom as a punishment for whatever transgression he thinks we've made, we're now faced with having difficulty exporting from Scotland to the United States, simply because our products, when they get to the US, are subject to an extra 10% tariff. Who pays this tariff, though? Well, actually, it's American consumers. So if American consumers want to order something from Scotland, when it gets to the United States, they have to pay a 10% tax on it to their own government, not to us, to their own government. But it does two things. It makes our goods being shipped to the United States more expensive, but at the same time, that's obviously going to drop the number of orders that we see, but it's also going to make Americans poorer, although they don't seem to realize this. And about 23% of Americans voting public actually thinks this is a great idea. They haven't really thought it through, and neither has Donald Trump, evidently. So, where does this leave us? Well, it leaves the United Kingdom adrift in the North Atlantic with no allies from the United States. In fact, it's now almost an enemy, because the United States is basically poised on the brink of declaring war on another NATO country. That would be an internal war inside an alliance led by a lunatic who thinks that he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize and is now threatening to start wars if he doesn't get a peace prize from a country which can't give them any peace prizes. This is so far down the rabbit hole that I can't believe that I'm even saying these words, but a lot of other commentators have mentioned this as well. So, where does that leave us? We're in a situation in Scotland which is almost unique in the United Kingdom. Perhaps only Wales might have a similar method of escape from this potential future of isolation from both Europe and the United States. And that is obvious. The obvious thing would be to withdraw, for Scotland to withdraw from the UK leave it to its own devices. They'd made the bed, let them lie in it, become independent again, in other words, return full nation status to a country which never really lost it, and then create a new trading arrangement with the EU, a new security and trade pact with the EU. And it doesn't need to be EU membership. The European Free Trade Association would do for trade, and we can also create a new security agreement with the EU, whereby Scotland would fall within the EU's military sphere, if you like, and inside the protective umbrella of all the combined armies of the European Union. At the moment, the European Union's politicians have not yet decided on unifying their armed forces into one collective defence force, but I believe that will happen because of the way pressure is mounting, both from Russia on the eastern borders of the EU and from the United States, which is basically cutting ties to the EU and to Great Britain. And if we don't move, if Scotland doesn't do something, then we're going to be dragged along further and further down this rabbit hole by the UK, which is unable to extricate itself from this and is still in denial over the existence of the so-called special relationship with the US, which has simply been destroyed by Donald Trump and no longer exists. We're now into uncharted territory politically. The UK is out in the cold. It doesn't have an ally in the United States anymore unless something drastic happens, and it's isolated itself from its European Union neighbours. And that's going to make things extraordinarily difficult for any British government to deal with. However, an independent Scottish government can deal with the EU in any way it likes, and that will compensate to a very large degree for any downturn in orders because of the actions of Donald Trump in the USA. I think the most appalling thing about this situation is this is Donald Trump's first year in office. He has another 3 to go. Imagine what other damage he could do in that time. Many political commentators, and I'm talking about global geopolitical commentators, have said that if Donald Trump were a Russian agent or an asset of the Russian state, he would behave exactly in the way he's doing now. And it's believed that Vladimir Putin is influencing Trump, because every time Trump makes a decision, he actually listens to the last person he spoke to before he opens his mouth. So Vladimir Putin knows this and ensures that he telephones Donald Trump before a big speech is made, so that he is the last person that Donald Trump spoke to. And we all know that Donald Trump admires dictators and authoritarians. He admires Putin. He's great pals with him, thinks he's a terrific guy. He admires other authoritarian leaders, Xi Jinping, although he doesn't have as great a relationship with him. And also the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. Just get the right Kim Jong. He went to visit him as well and has a special relationship with him too. It's all bros together. So Donald Trump, as I've said before, has been basically, I think he's been characterized by international political commentators as acting as though he were a Russian asset. Even if he's not, that's the way he's behaving, and that's the way he is moving the geopolitical Western alliance. He's trying to destroy NATO from within because he feels angry that he didn't get a peace prize. That's really the bottom line. That's how he makes his decisions. He feels like he's been snubbed, he's been ignored. He thinks he's brilliant. He thinks he's stopped 6 wars, whether he has or not. And now he feels like he's been rejected by the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, and so he's punishing another country completely and isolating America further. So Scotland really needs to get itself out of the United Kingdom, and to do that, the 3 main parties of independence in Scotland need to form an alliance. They need to do it very quickly. They need to recognise the threat that Donald Trump's actions now pose to the global world order, and also to extricate ourselves from this nuclear chokehold that the United Kingdom is in at the moment at the hands of Donald Trump, because the nuclear weapons stored in Scotland don't belong to the UK, they belong to the United States. And the United States is now Donald Trump. He sees those weapons as his. We need to get rid of those weapons, and we can't do that while we're part of the UK. We could do it if we were independent. We could just simply become independent, tell the United Kingdom to take the nuclear warheads off those submarine missiles, or simply sail all their submarines to one of their other ports in England and leave them there, because we're not going to be part of a political nuclear chess game involving an idiot like Donald Trump. I see a lot of dangers for Scotland in particular. We're heading towards a recession, and we're heading towards it because the United Kingdom is in its weakest international state that it's ever been in. And it's all because of Brexit and the heavy reliance on an unpredictable man-baby who's running the United States at the moment. The United Kingdom cannot move unless it either detaches itself from the United States and forms a new agreement with the European Union, which I don't think is going to happen, or it basically goes into oblivion with everyone else that the Americans have abandoned. I don't want to be beholden to Donald Trump. I would like Scotland to make its own decisions and to form its own strategic and military alliances with countries which are definitely friends. And the European Union countries are all definitely friendly towards Scotland. They see us as rational actors. They see us as a small but vigorous country with a lot to offer, with many resources that can be traded internationally across the North Sea. So we have enormous potential to trade with Europe, but our three parties of independence need to agree on a common strategy to win as big a majority in the Scottish elections here in May as possible. Declare independence as soon as they can. So it needs to be an election fought by three pro-independence parties on a ticket of full independence and a renegotiation of trading relationships with the EU as soon as we're independent, and an abandonment of the nuclear umbrella, because the nuclear weapons do not belong to us. We cannot control where they're targeted, who they're aimed at, or who fires them. That is all down to the orange man baby across the pond. Anyway, those are my thoughts today based on what I've been reading, and I've been reading quite extensively over the last few days about the very dangerous international situation that's developing. And I can't honestly see this rise in authoritarianism taking root in the European Union, although there are far-right parties, and Trump's Republicans have tried their best to export this extreme form of far-right warmongering and expansionist kind of attitudes into Europe's politicians as well, but they're not winning that battle. The European Union has rejected that. Its voters have rejected that. They want a stable, peaceful Europe without the extremism that's currently present in the US and without threatening expansion anywhere. And that is where I would want to be allied, not with the United States, but with our European allies across the pond. So those are my own thoughts, and you will have your own, I'm sure, and I'm guessing many of you will pick holes in what I've said. But basic problem here is that Scotland is now trapped. We're trapped with the UK between a rock and a hard place. We have no trading relationship that's of any great value to us with the European Union. And what's happening with the United States, if Donald Trump continues with his expansionist plans and his authoritarian threats, is going to mean that we'll be cut off from markets in the US with extreme tariffs, which Trump has promised to raise to 25% if we don't humiliate ourselves before Trump. That's what he's looking for. He's looking for the leaders of Western countries to basically humiliate themselves before him, to give in to him, to capitulate to his threats. And that's something that none of our politicians should ever do. John Swinney, take note. Anyway, that is it from Inde-Car today. I'm sorry, it's been a bit of a dramatic and worrying time, but we need to think about this as a country, and we need to press our politicians, our independence politicians, into forming a coherent strategy to win as huge a majority at the Scottish Parliament as possible, and have the courage to declare independence and to renegotiate our political and trading relationships with Europe as soon as possible, and to cut ties with the maniacal United States president as soon as we can, because this man is a danger to us all. That's it from Inde-Car today. Remember to keep the faith. I'll be back on your screens probably next week. Unfortunately, there is not going to be an edition of Hodma Jacob tomorrow, for which I apologise. The double glazing people are coming to my house tomorrow much earlier than they originally said, and so I'm not going to be able to broadcast tomorrow. I've told Norrie Hunter as well, so apologies from me. There will be no Hodma Jacob tomorrow morning. But in the meantime, keep the faith, and I'll see you next week. Bye for now.